before I begin my time, I'd like to extend a thank you to the judges here today for making this tournament possible. I'd like to thank Howard University for allowing us to host this, and I'd like to thank my coach and my team for supporting me. That being said, I'll begin on my first word. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. This famous, iconic quote is important when we look at today's question. Is it better to have close relations between the United States and Russia in an attempt to protect global security? When we look at the relations between the United States and Russia, Russia is not an ally, more like an antagonist in the story of the United States and Russia. You know, they might be a little bit friends, but they still have a little bit of beef. But at the end of the day, it's better to have Russia close to them, looking at their history and wars, and also looking at their region as a whole. So today's answer to this question is that in theory, it is better to have Russia and United States relations be closer, but when we look at the analysis, it's more of a gray area than a black and white answer. So today, we'll first be looking at the foundations of international relations and foreign policy and how this sets up how we treat United States and Russia relations, which will lead us into our second point, looking at the Trump and Biden administration and how they dealt with the Russia and Ukraine conflict. And finally, we'll be looking at, is this the best way to be solving this issue? So let's first look at this foundation of international relation policies and foreign policies. Dr. Karusta, 2025, from Howard University, writes, a simple assimilation, a different amount of policies that create the foundation of what we know as international affairs. He first starts out and tells us that after the 30-day war, the Treaty of Westphalia was created, creating sovereignty. So after this, we saw that sovereignty meant that there was no state that had control over another. So each state had things over control, such as religious freedom and economic development. After sovereignty was established in Europe, we saw that this system is now what our global system usually takes. Almost every continent is touched by sovereignty except Antarctica. But further, when we look at how this treats foreign policy, we look at the theory of recognition. When we recognize other states in terms of our global community, states have power or therefore a lack of power. Let's look at the example of Iran. Iran recognizes certain states and does not recognize certain states. In the 2012 Olympics, Iranian boxer got to the final round in the Olympics. However, he unfortunately had to concede because their competitor was not recognized by Iran's government. This is what happens in terms of our global community. When we don't recognize certain states, we have a destabilization of power within our global community. So how does this apply to United States and Russia relations? The Department of State and Department of Justice writes in their article and about their diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia, saying that post-Cold War, the United States has wanted to have relations between Russia, assuring mutual assured destruction and things of the nuclear armed missile race per the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, Russia publicly denounced diplomatic relations in 2014 with Vladimir Putin infringing on Ukraine's sovereignty. What we saw here is that Russia wanted to have nothing to do with the United States in 2014. However, as the Russia-Ukraine conflict infringed on Ukraine's sovereignty and it developed into a full-scale war post-2021 and 2022, we saw that the United States stance on Russia began to shift. The first when this conflict happened, the Biden administration was in charge, and they dedicated to support Ukraine at any necessary support until the war was over. This looked like a series of different things, supporting Ukraine economically and military, but also positioning themselves directly against Russia. This is something that is bold and substantial in terms of global relations. Russia is known as a rigid and void territory that makes war and conflict on ground very difficult. However, when we look at the economy of Russia, we see that this is where its weakness lies. We first have to look at the rally around the flag effect, which is an international relations theory, stating that in times of war, a leader becomes popular because of unity and community of war. This stipulation has been obsessed by Vladimir Putin, who now has made Russia's economy reliant on war and conflict. So when we look at things like economic relations, the Biden administration decided to put on staggering economic sanctions on Russia in hope to end the war. However, these sanctions have not been consistent. However, once Trump became inaugurated, he claimed that he was going to be increasing these economic sanctions. And I'm not the biggest supporter of Trump, but I am against war and conflict. However, we further see that back in the 2024 election, at the presidential debate between Vice President Harris and Presidential-elect Trump, he stated that in response to how is he going to solve the conflict in Ukraine, that he had Vladimir Putin on speed dial. This is where it gets confusing. How do we cooperate with having a dictator on speed dial and was the leader of a democracy? This is where the United States' reputation begins to go on the line. So in terms of global security, it would be best that the conflict in Russia is resolved in terms of United States involvement, but how does that look for the United States? We have to remember the political climate that Russia presents itself. So if Trump truly does have Vladimir Putin on speed dial, that's a little bit odd to me. However, when we look at the political state of Russia, we see that it's more of an authoritarianism post the Soviet Union and their communist policies. Authoritarianism is in direct conflict with democratic ideals, and that is what the United States essentially stands on. That can be debated, but that's what it says in our Constitution. But truly, at the end of the day, if we align ourselves with cooperation with Russia in an attempt to create global security and peace, that may not be the best solvency method. Do we get the ends and what we want at the end? But how we get there is what is messy. So today, let's look at our question again. Is it better to have closer relationships between the United States and Russia in terms of global security? In theory and practicality, global security is an important goal in our global affairs community. However, when we look at how we have to align ourselves in terms of United States foreign policy, this is where it gets messy and muddy. Going back to how this is not a black and white answer, but if the United States is aligning itself with authoritarian regimes such as Russia in an attempt to save Ukraine, it gets muddied and muddled, and essentially sends the picture and the theme that the United States aligns itself with authoritarianism. And this is something that may not be too far off looking at the Trump administration, with his attacks on the Department of Education, DEI, and other necessary federal programs. It might be indicative that Trump and his administration are aligning the United States to be more isolationist and authoritarianist. Is this the best thing for the United States? I don't know. That's not my question. But I am here to tell you that in terms of global security, this is a means and a way to achieve global security. But is this the best way? That's up for debate. So when we look at international relations and foreign policies, we look into that it is a global and gray area. As international relation theorists have said, that international relations is a series of high-stake puzzles. Essentially, there's more than one right answer to solve a problem. And this is what happens when we're looking at United States-Russia relations in terms of global security. Thank you.